Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Luke Gittos.
Hello.
Coming up on the show today, we'll be discussing how the London acid attacker gamed the asylum system, the Batley Grammar School teacher who's still in hiding, and the madness of Candace Owens. Now, if you're a fan of the show and you want to help us out, the best way to do that is by becoming a Spiked supporter. By giving just £5 or more per month, you can really help us to grow the channel. Plus, you'll get some exclusive perks for yourself while reading the Spiked website. So you'll get ad-free reading, access to events, and all kinds of things like that. If you want to find out more, just go to spiked-online.com/supporters. So new court documents came to light this week in the case of Abdul Ezedi, the man who was the alkali attacker several months ago. We now know that he's drowned in the Thames. He was given a funeral recently. Tom, I mean, this case was bad enough already. He, was convicted of sexual assault. He'd been denied asylum twice before eventually being accepted. And now what we've learned makes it seem even worse.
No, absolutely. It was almost as if every time we get more news about this case, the more damning it seems for everyone involved. As you say, not only had he come to the country illegally and been denied asylum twice, but also this was in the context of him having committed 2 sexual offences in this country. He then is granted asylum, he has his appeal overturned. And what Sky News have overturned this week is more of the court documents that went into that particular successful appeal in Newcastle in 2020. And it revolves specifically around his Christian conversion, in inverted commas. This is something that we had known about, but seeing the full details of it are pretty damning. So a retired Baptist preacher, a gentleman by the name of Reverend Roy Merrin, was very instrumental in advocating on his behalf. He talked about his conversion, the fact that he was baptised by immersion. There was photographs that were provided as well of Ezedi handing out leaflets for the church. Most striking, I think, that also came out of it was a contract which was released, which was between Baptists Together, which seems to be the sort of denomination or the organisation that this particular church belonged to, making clear that they were fully aware of his sexual assault and sexual exposure convictions, because they basically drew up this agreement where they said he wouldn't come to church without his chaperone, effectively, and that he wouldn't come on days other than Sunday and so on. So what we've seen is, in this case, the church and this retired reverend advocating very stringently on his behalf, whilst knowing full well about his particular case, and the fact that by the judge's own words, this was the thing that really clinched it for him. So obviously one, might not place too much judgment on a reverend who thinks he's saved a soul, and that whole philosophy of, no one is so lost that they can't be brought back to morality and to Jesus, etc. But why the entire system is so credulous in the face of those claims, why the fact that this was all it took for a judge in particular to decide that this clearly dangerous individual should be allowed to stay, and he goes on to commit one of the most horrific violent attacks imaginable, is damning all round, frankly, in terms of that sort of it's not just the credulity of this church or this individual reverend, it's like kind of structural credulousness, if you like, that has been revealed by this case.
And the Home Office had pretty much decided that they thought his conversion was a sham. Luke, what goes through the mind of a judge when they decide to disregard the fact that Ezedi is basically quite obviously lying, the fact that he has these convictions, and then decides to grant him asylum anyway?
I think that is the central question raised by this case, because I don't think anyone now in hindsight will defend this judge's decision to grant his appeal. It's clear that the Home Office guidelines actually states that judges should not take the word of individual ministers as definitive evidence of someone's conversion to Christianity. So the black and white guidance says this should not be the final word, but this judge appears to have. I mean, it's difficult because we haven't seen all the court documents. Normally when you judge or make comment on a judge's decision, you do need to see everything that he saw. But it does look like this individual minister's evidence was given far, far too much weight, and the results have been catastrophic. I think what the case shows is the real danger of the mind of the judiciary, which has to be objective, removed, logical, reasoned, being influenced by the wider discussion around asylum, because there is this way of understanding asylum in the public mind, which is asylum seekers are all good people who are coming here with good motivations and who are always deserving of our sympathy. And in many cases that will be true, and in some cases it will be false. Asylum cases require the very, very careful balance between our willingness as a country to be compassionate and public safety. And in the public discussion, the issues relating to public safety in the context of asylum just haven't had the same weight as the discussion around compassion and the need to extend compassion. So I think judges have to try and remove themselves completely from politics, and they have to try and consider these cases objectively. And we haven't seen the whole picture here, but it is extraordinary that in the face of what the Home Office says about this case, had said about this case, and in the face of what the Home Office says in its own guidance about how to approach these cases, it does seem remarkable that the judges come down in this way.
And Tom, I mean, we saw, when straight after the attack happened, there was a sort of quite quick consensus formed among the sort of liberal elite that this attack had nothing to do with his asylum claim, and that, that essentially there was a sense that you mustn't demonise asylum seekers. You can't say anything bad about any individual asylum seeker.
No, absolutely. That reflex was fascinating. I think it was most absurdly demonstrated by that Newsnight segment between Tory MP Caroline Noakes and Labour MP Belle Ribeiro Addy, whose constituency in South London was where this attack took place, where they both flatly say, more or less, that this case isn't really about asylum. And then they get into this discussion about microaggressions, as if, Ezedi had been accused of calling his victim darling rather than throwing alkali in her face. So this was the sort of reaction. And it wasn't just two outrider MPs either. Obviously, Gillian Keegan, a Tory frontbencher, went on the media that weekend and said that this isn't really about asylum. And it's really maddening. I mean, it speaks to what a superficial debate we have over these issues, and how under the kind of banner of being compassionate towards asylum seekers, they actually make excuses for some horrendous behaviour. I mean, not only was allowing Ezedi to stay in the country something which puts British-born UK citizens at risk, it also puts at risk other people who are here looking for a better life. I mean, his victim, to the extent we know much about her and her young children, she seemed to have been in a relationship with Ezedi at some point, but also she was staying in a local refugee hotel, which would heavily imply that she herself was here trying to look for a better life. So there is nothing kind or caring or compassionate about trying to make excuses for these kinds of oversights, for trying to pretend that in any sane country that someone should be allowed to come here illegally, almost immediately start sexually assaulting women, and then be allowed to stay. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I think there's a tendency to talk about the cowardice of politicians in this discussion, that they're terrified of looking anti-migrant or whatever, and I think that's obviously a part of it, but I think it's worse than that almost. I think it's more narcissism. They are so attached to this image of themselves as being, fighting on behalf of the oppressed or whatever, or being seen to say the right things, that they'll willfully embrace positions which actually endanger the very people they claim to speak on behalf of. So it's almost worse than being cowardly. They're just more interested in their own superficial self-image than actually the lives that are at stake here.
Yeah. Luke,
well, I think that is the mindset that could infect judges dealing with these cases, that they become willing to almost take a gamble with public safety in order to appear compassionate. And that's the major risk. So I agree with all of that. I think the sensible position is also to say, look, what you do next is a careful balancing act. It's not right to say that the asylum system that we have in this country is incredibly lax and that we're letting everyone in. In fact, to some extent, this case does show that the Home Office can be very brisk and quick to refuse applications. And it is a high bar to gain asylum in this country. And arguably, in cases that are deserving, we could be more flexible and more liberal. But these cases do the progressive asylum cause no favours. Yeah. Because it completely fails to appreciate that there is that balancing act that needs to be maintained, not just for the sake of public safety, but for the integrity. I mean, the integrity of our borders is an important thing for our country. It's an important thing that we all need to feel and experience. And when people don't feel in control of that process, and when they feel like the process is arbitrary, then that's when things can get dangerous.
And I think a lot of people will probably be scratching their heads and wondering why he was still in the country after 2 failed attempts anyway, let alone the subsequent appeal.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a big part of the problem as well, because I take your point, Luke, about the idea that, the door is swung open to absolutely everyone. But also there's the problem of how dysfunctional and slow it is. So I'm also reminded of the case of Ahmad al-Swelmi, who was the Liverpool Women's Hospital bomber, who, when he blew himself up, thankfully only killing himself, back in 2021, was it? He also had 2 failed asylum applications and a fake conversion to Christianity under his belt. I think he was in the process of trying to appeal on the basis of his supposed new Christian faith, even though, of course, as it turns out, he was had been attending Ramadan services recently, and there was a prayer mat in his lodging. So even the kind of dysfunction and the failure to, when it's quite clear that this is a case that the system has decided isn't open to being allowed to stay, that still the inability for that to result in them actually being removed or for some other consequence to take place allows room for terrible things to happen as well, even when on paper they haven't been granted the right to stay.
We all want to live healthy lives, but with so many options out there, making the right choices can sometimes feel overwhelming. Every self-appointed online expert seems to have a different view of what's best for us. Well, with AG1, getting healthy has become a whole lot simpler. AG1 is a daily nutrition supplement that makes living well effortless. Just 1 scoop contains 70 high-quality ingredients, all designed to hit your baseline nutritional needs. Lately, I've been enjoying drinking AG1 with my breakfast. I just mix 1 scoop of AG1 powder with water, and in less than a minute, I have everything I need to seize the day. In that single scoop, AG1 contains a variety of vital vitamins and nutrients that help you stay on top form. For instance, AG1 gives you the vitamin C and zinc you need to keep up your immune health, so you can say goodbye to those nasty colds that keep kicking you down. For me, though, the most surprising benefit of AG1 is how much it's reduced my stress levels. Keeping an even mood has become wonderfully easy. The best part about AG1 is how trustworthy it is. It only contains the highest quality ingredients, and the team at AG1 are constantly tweaking and innovating these ingredients, so my morning scoop just keeps getting better. So, if you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/spiked. That's drinkag1.com/spiked to find out more. Check it out. So let's move on to talk about the Batley Grammar School incident. It's been 3 years since a teacher was essentially sent into hiding after showing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad in a religious studies class. There were huge protests gathered outside the school. Recent reports have suggested that no one really in power or in the local authority ever condemned the protest. He was never considered to be a victim of a crime, despite the persistent harassment and intimidation he obviously felt. Tom, I mean, this case is just, surely just shocks everyone. It's quite an eye-opener as to what's going on in this country.
Absolutely. And the fact that all this time later, as far as we can tell, I haven't seen any reporting suggest otherwise, he still more or less remains in hiding, hasn't gone back to work at the school. It just feels like continuing to unfurl sort of tragedy and complete failure to stick by him. The recent Dame Sarah Khan report, which has sort of brought this back into the conversation, it is also 3 years on, the two probably were timed to coincide with one another, really points out that he was failed more or less at every level. So almost immediately after this controversy begins, you have the school issue this grovelling apology and to suspend him. There's this really strange twist as well, where an officer from West Yorkshire Police read out this statement to the crowd of protesters outside. So you had the kind of police being implicated almost in this act of capitulation. You had the local MPs basically in not so many words say that the school made the right decision by taking this. The response from the Department for Education, then led by Gavin Williamson, if anyone remembers him, was again sort of trying to look both ways on this particular issue, condemning threats and intimidation, but also saying that they need to balance the school needs to balance its responsibilities with to educate, with being sensitive to religious sensitivities and so on. And so what this amounted to was a rank capitulation to hardliners and zealots who wanted to dictate what a school could teach. And not only did it take this tremendous personal toll on this teacher, who by all accounts seems like a pretty upstanding person who's been completely thrown under the bus by this whole process. In the new report, because Sarah Khan seems to have spoken to him directly, he talks about having essentially almost like PTSD as a consequence of what he'd been through. But also the fact that the school dropped this material from their curriculum.
Yeah.
He wasn't going rogue when he taught this. Apparently, he'd been taught for at least 2 years previously without any incident. And so what we have is a situation in which you have hardline, religious activists, authoritarians dictating a school curriculum, and yet everyone's fine with it because of the supposed community sensitivities involved. It's such a... It's on the one hand, it's shocking, but it's not surprising. This is often the case in things like this.
Yeah, I mean, we often see that, and just thinking about that, with the police reading out the statements of the protesters. I mean, we saw a similar thing in Wakefield, where, you know, a young boy was accused of scuffing a Quran, and, you know, his mother sat next beside a police officer, and the police officer is giving, you know, this boy a non-crime hate incident and doing nothing about the people trying to intimidate a child.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I was really interested to read the Khan review, because I think what is fascinating about that report is that it tries to situate the Batley incident in the context of lots of other kinds of harassment. So it says this incident occurred at a time when we have massive online hate, and we have lots of people hassling politicians, and we have women. She cites one case about a Sikh woman who was harassed by local Sikh fundamentalists and feared for her life. And all of this is part of the same picture, according to Khan. I think that's just completely wrong, because it fails to appreciate the unique circumstances around Islamist intimidation. And the unique element of this, as Tom suggested, is the official capitulation around it. And so it fails to identify that or ask why it is that when this intimidation is coming from Islamists, people in the establishment, the police, schools, councils, and to some extent the government seem totally willing to capitulate. And I think the review missed a trick in failing to engage with that question.
Definitely. I mean, it seems that people are reluctant to even use the word Islamist. I mean, we saw, you know, several weeks ago when the Speaker of the House of Commons felt, you know, sufficiently intimidated to change parliamentary procedure. There was lots of sort of vague accusations of where this intimidation might be coming from. We all knew where it was coming from, but they couldn't say it.
And it's also worth saying, because there was another report that came out a couple of weeks ago, which was an independent report, but the Commission for Countering Extremism put it out as a sort of government body. And it was making the point, amongst others, that first of all, a lot of this anti-blasphemy activism which is taking place, it's really something that we really need to take very, very seriously. Because on the one hand, many of the people involved will explicitly say, you know, we don't want violence. We want, I think one of the lead campaigners outside Batley said Muslims should make their views known in the democratic way. And yet you look at all of these cases that have been talking about, Wakefield, Batley, the Lady of Heaven protest, and the people involved have very close links or a lot of nice things to say about violent extremist anti-blasphemy movements in Pakistan, where this has become a horrendous issue over the course of the past 10 or 15 years in particular. So they're kind of looking both ways on those issues, a lot of these activists. So there's a refusal to recognise that. But another thing that report points out, which is often not recognised in this discussion, is that this isn't just a case of the kind of the right of a white Brit to sound off about Muhammad or Islam or whatever, that often the people who are very much at the sharp end of anti-blasphemy activism are liberal Muslims, ex-Muslims, or members of dissenting Muslim sects. I mean, the two people who have been killed, as far as I can tell, over the course of the past 10 or 15 years in this country, as a consequence of being painted as heretics or blasphemers, were both Muslims themselves. It was an Ahmadi Muslim, Assad Shah, and a Muslim imam in Rochdale, I believe. They were killed within about a month of each other. He was called Jalal Uddin, and he was killed by some kind of ISIS fanboy. Shah was killed by just a sort of would-be anti-blasphemy activist. And also, you know, people forget about Hatton Tash, who's the sort of ex-Muslim, now kind of Christian preacher, spends a time at Speaker's Corner wearing a Charlie Hebdo t-shirt and preaching against her former faith. I mean, she was stabbed multiple times. They never caught her assailant. And more recently, she was the main target of a terror plot to try and kill her and also to attack any other policemen and soldiers in nearby. People never really talk about these cases precisely because of the fact that they don't fit the narrative, which is beloved by both Islamists and kind of credulously repeated by wokists, which is that to be concerned about the attempt to clamp down on supposed anti-Islamic blasphemy is to engage in basically a kind of form of racism. You want to gin up some kind of clash of civilizations, that's what your main game is. Those inconvenient victims disrupt that, which is part of the reason why, despite them kind of suffering the kind of lethal consequences in some cases of this anti-blasphemy, bigotry and activism, they're not talked about in the slightest.
Yeah. Luke?
And I also think, I mean, we experienced this in East London in the aftermath of October the 7th, when a young child at a local school went to school draped in a Palestinian flag, was sent home, told not to wear a flag to school, and that led to demonstrations outside the school. And I think there is a general reluctance to say that some form of protest, and especially when the protests take the form that can be very intimidating, just aren't acceptable. You know, a school is not the appropriate place to have out a demonstration about Gaza. And, you know, we've seen similarly the walkouts and the children leaving school in order to attend Gaza demonstrations. There has to be a line drawn about the nature of these protests, because, of course, freedom of expression is important. And that has to be balanced against the need to maintain... The right does not extend to being intimidatory with your protest for the reasons that Tom has explored. So we see this play out on the streets of local communities in ways which might fall behind violence even, but can still be extremely intimidating and create a climate where people are very worried about engaging in debate.
So right-wing influencer Candace Owens has left the Daily Wire under a storm of accusations of anti-Semitism. Shall we take a look at some of her work?
So I was trying to reconcile the Jewish people that I grew up with and who I love with this sort of DC Jew who was using these words not because they believed that what they were hearing was actually anti-Semitism or Jew hating, but to basically silence people. What if that is what is happening right now in Hollywood, if there is just a very small ring of specific people who are using the fact that they are Jewish to shield themselves from any criticism? A ring in Hollywood, also a ring potentially in DC, that we should start to ask those questions.
She's also, should say, been accused of liking a tweet that hinted that a rabbi drinks Christian blood, to add to that. Tom, what have you made of this? I mean, it's just the right going down the same old rabbit hole.
No, and she's not the only one on that kind of section of the sort of cranky, very online right who have gone down this particular path. I mean, it's grimly fascinating, isn't it? The way in which you have someone who is almost increasingly becoming, I don't know if radicalised is the right word, or this sort of bigotry creeping into the point where you're liking a tweet, as you say, which accuses quite a prominent rabbi of being drunk on Christian blood again. I think fascinatingly, Owens claimed she hadn't read the whole tweet before she liked it, even though the tweet's about 12 words long. So I don't know how busy her schedule is. I mean, she's got a bit of form on this front. I mean, when Kanye West went on his kind of anti-Semitic tirades a few years ago, and he had that infamous tweet where he said that he's going to go DEFCON 3 on the Jews. She basically defended it, tried to contextualise it, suggested that no honest person reading that particular tweet could think that it was anti-Semitic, had all kinds of convoluted reasons as to why that might be the case. But more recently, as you suggest, seemingly engaging in what looked to anyone like anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, if you're talking about rings and groups of powerful Jews in Washington, DC or Hollywood who are going out of their way to bring you down, to bring down critics of Israel, it's not a huge stretch to suggest that you're dealing and trading in some quite anti-Semitic ideas. But as I say, there's a section. It's not all of the kind of anti-woke, supposedly anti-woke, very online right who have gone down this kind of Israelophobic to increasingly anti-Semitic direction, but it's a significant contingent of them. And it really wouldn't surprise me if part of the story there is the fact that a lot of these influencers, including Candace Owens, who have become particularly kind of anti-Israel in that quite bigoted fashion, also have this very conspiratorial thing going on, and those two always go together grimly well, don't they?
Yeah, always, unfortunately. Luke, what have you made of it?
Well, I think Candace Owens is an example of a very mainstream, very widespread failure to understand the nature of anti-Semitism. Because I don't think she thinks she's anti-Semitic. That might be true. But nor do many people who say openly anti-Semitic things or who openly engage in anti-Semitic tropes. I was reminded about the Labour councillor whose name you will remind me of, who who was sacked by the Labour Party for claiming that Israel had some involvement in October the 7th.
Oh yeah, Azhar Ali, was that it?
Yeah, yeah. So in the aftermath of that, in Labour trying to scrabble around and explain why they didn't immediately act, and they said that the comment that they thought for a while the comments might be anti-Israeli but not anti-Semitic, and it just shows that there is this failure amongst even very influential people in this country that anti-Semitism is insidious because it's conspiratorial. It creates ideas that Jews are somehow controlling things behind the scenes. All of these are very old tropes that have existed for a very long time. And people don't recognise them when they see them, whether that be here in the UK or in America with Candace Owens. So I think that people need to understand that anti-Semitism is different to other forms of racism in that it's often how it informs the way you speak about people. You know, Candace Owens talks about a ring, as Tom mentioned. She talks about, you know, the DEFCON 5 thing, DEFCON 3 thing. It was about, you know, it was about being defensive against some sort of invasion. You know, that was what Kanye was saying. He was defending himself against the invasion of what he saw to be an insidious force. And these are all classically anti-Semitic tropes. And you know, this widespread misunderstanding about what makes anti-Semitism different to other forms of racism, I think has been catastrophic and has led to a moment where we are experiencing, I think, a real resurgence in anti-Semitism. It is possible to be concerned about the actions of the Israeli government without spilling into anti-Semitism, but people discussing this issue frequently fail to make that distinction.
And it does also seem, for many of these people on the right who are, it seems odd for them to be concerned about civilian losses in Gaza when they're so openly pro-Russia or any of these other things, or just such, you know, pose as ostentatiously anti-humanitarian in so many other contexts.
Well, exactly, and you know, we talk about the Believe All Women stuff, the fact that Israelis have been called on to prove the fact that their citizens were raped on October the 7th repeatedly. So all of this is part of an anti-Semitic way of thinking about the world, that Jews are capable of appalling deceit, that they are out to manipulate people into believing a particular narrative in their favour. All of this is as old as Jewish people being in Europe. You know, this has always been there, and it's a tragedy that it's showing its face again today.
And Tom, just on the sort of conspiratorial element of the new right or the online right, because you know, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories aren't the beginning of this. I mean, we've had claims about a stolen election. Many of them are anti-vaxxers as well. You know, there's just this claims about Taylor Swift even potentially being a government psyop orchestrated by Joe Biden. I mean, it just seems to be a sort of madness creeping in.
Absolutely. I think I'm right in saying that before she was officially canned by the Daily Wire, Candace Owens was going around suggesting that Brigitte Macron was a man, for instance. This is the sort of just day-to-day kind of engagement in mad theories and conspiracy theories, which has just become common coin amongst a certain section of the online right. And it's something which obviously has always provided the kindling for anti-Semitism. I mean, the conspiratorial component of anti-Semitism is one of the things that really distinguishes it, and one of the things that has given it such power historically. And one of the reasons, incidentally, while we're talking a lot about the right here, who obviously embrace conspiratorial thinking in a big way, but also you see reflected on the left as well, in the Israelophobic left, some of the people who figures like Candace Owens have become oddly friendly with in recent months because of the fact that it maps onto their quite conspiratorial view of the world, insofar as that, you know, the system is basically a kind of plot by the 1% against the 99%. Doesn't take very long for that to fit quite neatly onto some of the old stereotypes about small rings or groups of Jews who are running world affairs, running the economy in their own interests and screwing everyone else. So really tackling the new anti-Semitism, or tackling anti-Semitism full stop, also means taking on the unreason and the irrationality that this new conspiracy theory culture has brought with us. Because it's really no surprise that we have seen that really bloom on the right in a horrendous way over recent years, that now we're also seeing anti-Semitism make its resurgence there as well.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.